Okay, so welcome to the GLO Monthly Talk. We happen the first Thursday of the month, every month at 1 o'clock London time. Today's speaker is Michael Coon, who I had the pleasure of first meeting in an airport van on the way to the Southern Economics meetings in New Orleans several years ago. And he keeps rising in the profession, and he will be talking about borders. I didn't keep that piece of paper in front of me. Okay.
Okay, it's my first slide.
So the way it usually works is the total time is an hour. So take 45 minutes. People will ask clarification type questions. What do we put them in the chat? Is that what we do?
Yeah, people can put them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask the question. If Michael, as long as you are happy for people to interrupt during the seminar.
Yeah, that's fine. In fact, I encourage it. As I'll mention, this is somewhat of a work in progress, so any comments, suggestions, or anything are definitely welcome.
So, Michael, you want to share your screen and go ahead.
So in the meantime, could everybody mute their microphones, please? And of course, as I said, unmute if you have a question. And just to remind everyone that it's being recorded as well. So it will be available on the website by Monday.
All right. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be presenting here today. The paper I'll be presenting is titled Border Fencing, Migrant Flows and Crossing Deaths. And this is joint work with Cynthia, Bansak, Abigail, Blanco, and myself. This is, like I said, it's somewhat of a work in progress, somewhat not. Most of what I'm going to be presenting here today appears in our short version of the paper, which is forthcoming in the AEA Papers and Proceedings. And we're building out the longer version with a lot more detail. So I'm going to add a little bit more to, I know some of you have seen me present this before. Add a little bit more to this. We're also going to be bringing on another co-author, Susie Derringer, who's a colleague at University of Tampa, who I believe just joined the presentation as well. She's a GIS expert who's going to help us build out the maps and things that we need to get more detailed and better use of our data. So what we're looking at specifically is the effects of the 2006 Secure Fence Act on migrants' choice of where to cross the border if they're crossing, and somewhat of an unintended consequence of adding border fencing along the southern U.S. border, which is increasing the probability of death while trying to cross. So to give a little bit of motivation and background, I'll just start with some of this might be familiar to many of you, maybe some of you, maybe not. In the United States, we've had over the last couple of decades a dramatic rise in the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States, from about 3.5 million in 1990 to a peak of around 12 million in 2006, and then it somewhat dropped down and leveled out around 10 to 11 million people today. What's important about that is, meaningful immigration reform in Congress has been stalled for decades. Nothing has really been done much other than the 2006 Secure Fence Act since the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. And one of the issues that holds up legislation is there's a very large share of Congress members who are unwilling to do anything that increases the number of legal immigrants in the United States until we get secure our southern border. And so generally any talks about immigration reform that raises the number of people who are allowed in the US legally come along with some sort of increased funding for Border Patrol, or more recently, a lot of talk about building more fencing along the southern border. In addition to that, there's another share of the population who believes that we need to secure the border to prevent illegal crossings because it increases crime or the potential for terrorism and those types of things. I have some evidence on the crime thing later on that I'll talk about from another paper, not mine, somebody else's. But as I mentioned,
how do you document undocumented population?
Well, so these are estimates. Generally, the Department of Homeland Security has a model that they use to estimate. They use census data, which counts everybody, and then compares that to the number of census data can track foreign-born versus native-born, and then they compare that to the number of documented and do some estimates of that. But yeah, these are estimates mostly from the Department of Homeland Security. But yeah, I mean, by definition, they're not documented. So these are estimates.
No, basically what I'm wondering is, I mean, I can see that the frequency of the data points has increased from around 2005. And so it seems that this became more of an issue at that point, which may also be the case. So what I'm worried about is that when someone starts taking issue with this and starts making pronouncements that we will reduce illegal immigration, whether they can actually, whether they're not just reporting numbers that seem to prove that they have done a good job, because essentially once the frequency of data points has increased, that the numbers started to come down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for the purposes of this presentation today, this is not the data that I'm using for my estimations, but
okay.
But yeah, it could be the case that they're trying to show. But I believe there are other independent agencies that estimate this as well for comparison purposes.
I just want to point, Michael, I just want to point out, I know this isn't your data, that beforehand, that is when it's every so often, it's probably based on the census, which has a 5-year look back. And then after 2000 or so, we start getting the ACS, which gives us a yearly estimate, which is sort of a survey based on the census, because Congress didn't want to do the long form anymore, and the census was asked all the good questions. Okay, so that's my guess here. Oh, but as long as using this for illustration, one of the problems is back here, right? This is just after the IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act, comes in, which regularized or legalized a lot of the undocumented workers in the country before then. So it may not be the perfect starting point.
Right. Nevertheless, so to that end, over that same period, the budget for the Border Patrol has increased roughly 15-fold, from about 265 million in 1990 to 4 billion in 2022. And again, all of this time that the budget was rising, the undocumented population was rising as well. So again, that led a lot of people to change their efforts in how we secure the border. And a lot of people started calling for building a wall. So if you were paying attention to the United States over the last 6 or 7 years or so, the 2016 presidential campaign was centered around building a wall. Very little was actually built since 2016. But now more recently, we have politicians in border states along the southern border of the US who are advocating for using state funds. The governor of Texas is dedicating, I think it was few $1 billion towards building a wall along the border of Texas. And then there's some state senators in Arizona who are advocating building a wall on state lands in Arizona as well. So they're trying to take it into their own hands. And so the motivation for this paper is kind of to, if we're talking about building more fencing along the southern border, it's worth looking back to see what the existing fencing that's already there has done, right? So what we're looking at here is the impacts of the 2006 Secure Fence Act. The Secure Fence Act was implemented under the Bush administration, and it authorized the construction of hundreds of miles of additional fencing along the southern border, as well as vehicle barriers, other checkpoints, other infrastructure, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, cameras, satellites, a bunch of other things, as well as a surge or increase in the number of agents working along the border. So between 2006 and 2009, there was about 613 miles of fencing, both pedestrian fencing and vehicle barriers, built along the southern US border from California to Texas. So here we show the construction of the fencing. As you can see, prior to the 2006 Secure Fence Act, there was some existing fencing. Most of it was pedestrian barrier. About 55 miles of pedestrian barrier existed prior to the Secure Fence Act. This is mostly in the San Diego area. Very little vehicle barrier existed. After the Secure Fence Act, there was 346 miles of pedestrian fencing along the southern US borders in 2009. Again, a little bit more has been built since then. You can see this is the little tiny bit that was built after 2016. And then about an additional 287 miles of vehicle barrier was built along the southern US border. So the first thing that we'd want to think about is what does this do in terms of reducing the flow of migrants? It's a little bit murky. So one proxy to looking at migrant flows is using the number of apprehensions as a proxy for the number of people crossing the border. So here we have a number of apprehensions by year. Prior to the Secure Fence Act, there was a little over 1 million apprehensions in 2005. There was a substantial drop after that. Like I said, it's a little bit murky because this also coincides with the Great Recession. So it's hard to say how much of this drop was due to the fence and how much it was due to just there weren't economic opportunities, so it wasn't really worth crossing. And then it kind of leveled out around 2012, and more recently it's risen up again. If you look at the numbers today, that they're changing the way that they're reporting it. So rather than apprehensions, they're reporting encounters, which is a little bit different because they have people that they're just turning away. And so it's somewhat inflating the numbers, but we're back in 2021 and 2022, or 2021, we had again over 1 million encounters, 1.6 million encounters at the southern US border. So the numbers of people crossing the border have definitely risen quite a bit. So prior research has looked at the effect of the Secure Fence Act. There's a recent paper by Feigenberg in 2020 where he does a synthetic control model looking at data from the Mexican side of the border, looking at the probability that people who live along the border cross. He found that people who live in municipalities where fencing was built, it reduces the probability that they cross by about 27%, and the probability that people who live in adjacent areas, adjacent municipalities, to cross by about 15%, right? And so effectively what this does is if you're living on the Mexican side of the border where they built a fence, it increases your cost of crossing because now you have to travel east or west to get to somewhere where it's now possible to cross. But for people who are coming from the interior part from non-border states, generally what it does is it changes where they cross and doesn't have a really large effect on whether they decide to cross or not. One thing that Feigenberg points out, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, is he claims that the fence construction and the timing of fence construction after the Secure Fence Act was plausibly exogenous. So it wasn't really determined by migrant flows per se. It was more determined by how easy it was to construct the fence. So for the federal government to construct fencing, they have to have the rights to the land. They have to be able to get the supplies in and out relatively easily. They have to do environmental impact studies to make sure it's not going to affect the migratory patterns of certain animals, things like that. So part of their goal was just to build as much fence as fast as possible. So they built fence where it was easier to build rather than necessarily where it would prevent more migration. I'll argue that, if it's somewhere that was easy to build, it's probably somewhere that's easy to cross as well. And so there is kind of a relationship there, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Another recent paper in 2019 by Alan Dobbin Martin also looked at the choice of whether to cross, where to cross, et cetera. They had really nice access to the administrative data for the matricula consular card, which is a form of ID that migrants in the United States can get from the Mexican consulate. And they matched where they came from and where they were living. They found that it had very minimal impact on whether or not people migrated, but rather changed their choice of destination within the US and the route that they took to get to that destination. They also did some other estimates on how it affected the economy, in particular wages. And so they found that it increased low-skilled workers' wages by roughly $3 a year, not a whole lot, and decreased high-skilled wages by, again, a little over $3 a year, not a whole lot. In terms of as I mentioned, some people want to build the fence because of crime. There's this kind of trope that if somebody crosses the border illegally, then by definition they're a criminal, so they're going to commit other crimes. There's not a lot of evidence to support that, but Admin and Fode, in a 2022 article just recently out in the Eastern Economic Journal, they estimated the effects of the border fence on crime in border counties where the fence was built, and found really no evidence of any change in property or violent crime rates. But going back to Allen, Dobbin, and Morton, they are focused really on three possible effects that the fencing can have. They call one the deterrence effect, right? Whether or not it changes the decision on whether to migrate at all. Again, they find very little evidence of that. I think they estimate that elasticity to be 0.1. So some effect, but very, very little. Then they have the diversion effect, which changes where they choose to migrate to in the United States. So for example, if you're planning on going to San Diego and they built a lot of fencing in San Diego, you might change your mind to go to Dallas instead, because it's easier to cross the border. And once you cross the border, you're closer to Dallas. So they have the diversion effect. They find evidence of that. And then they have the detour effect for given where you're going to locate in the United States, you might take a different route to get to that destination. So you're going to Dallas, but they built a wall, and so you have to go around the wall rather than going through the wall. And so that adds additional cost. You have to travel farther. It's a little bit more complicated of a route. I really enjoy papers and theories that use alliteration. So I thought that I would stick with the alliteration effect and add 2 Ds of my own, danger and death. So going back to this idea, if you're building the fence where it's easy to build, typically you're talking about relatively flat land, close to a highway, close to an urban area, something like that. So if you're building the fence in those areas and people are then having to go around the fence, then they're going to be crossing in places that are harder to build fence and therefore also harder to cross. So you're having to go through large swaths of desert that aren't close to a major road. You might have to cross over the river rather than over land. So water crossings are a little bit more dangerous. Again, the fencing is largely built on federal or state land. So if you have to cross on a private land, like a ranch or something like that, those aren't patrolled as regularly, and they're not. So that if you kind of get lost and you're dehydrated, there's less of a chance that somebody's going to find you and come across you. So there's a higher chance you might dehydrate and have other problems. And you're going in more remote locations, longer routes. So maybe you don't pack enough food or you get lost or something like that. And so those crossing in more dangerous areas are going to increase the probability of death. There's some prior evidence to support this idea going back to the 1990s. So in the 1990s, the Clinton administration instituted a series of operations that surged Border Patrol agents to El Paso, San Diego, and Tucson. They called them Operation Blockade, Gatekeeper, and Safeguard. And so Cornelius 2001 Eisbach et al. Documented that following those operations, migrants, rather than crossing in urban areas like El Paso and San Diego, they started to cross in more remote desert areas in Arizona and those areas, and dramatically increased the number of migrant deaths that were occurring. They say prior to these operations, the largest cause of death for migrants was getting hit by a car trying to cross the highway or something like that. And then as they started crossing in the desert, they were more likely to die of like hypothermia and starvation and those types of things. All right, so to estimate the impacts of the Fence Act on migrant deaths and migrant crossings, we estimate a simple difference in difference model on 2 dependent variables. First being the number of apprehensions, which we estimate in log form to look at kind of the change in shares rather than change in levels. And then the migrant deaths as a share of apprehensions, this should be times 100,000, not just deaths. So we estimate the deaths per 100,000 apprehensions. So that's a little bit of a mistake there. And so our kind of key indicator variables are whether or not the Border Patrol Sector I received significant amounts of fencing after the Secure Fence Act in 2006, This SFA is a post 2006 dummy variable, time variable. And then we have our interaction term, which gives us the difference in difference estimator. And then we have a small vector of controls looking at the number of months where the high temperature was above 80 degrees, the number of Border Patrol agents working in that sector in a given year. And then we have a time fixed effect in there as well. Our data primarily comes from the Department of Homeland Security, Border Patrol sector profiles that gives us details on the number of apprehensions, the number of agents working in a sector in a given year, and the number of deaths encountered in that sector in a given year. I'll note here our data on deaths is likely an underestimate. It only counts deaths that within the US that the Border Patrol agents had an encounter with. So there is evidence of people who die in the desert and then are not found, and so there's a lot of deaths in the deserts and things that are going unrecorded. It also doesn't count any deaths that occurred on the Mexican side. So if somebody was trying to cross the river and they drowned, but they washed up on the Mexican side, that wouldn't be showing up in our data as well. So just kind of keep that in mind, that whatever we find here in terms of the change in death rate, probably an underestimate. Our data on the border fence comes from an article entitled America's Wall by Castañeda and Guerrero. This is not an academic article. This is actually a news article. I would encourage all of you to check it out. It's really cool. They have an interactive map that shows everywhere that border fencing was built since 1992 up until the present. And so we reached out to them and said, that's a really cool map you have. Can you give us the data? And they said, yeah. So we're using it. So to give you a little bit idea here, the US border with Mexico is about 2,000 miles long, a little under 2,000 miles long. It's broken up into 9 Border Patrol sectors. So San Diego, Centro, Yuma, Tucson. Yuma and Tucson cover most of the border with Arizona. San Diego is mostly with border with California. The El Paso sector has just West Texas, where El Paso is, and then New Mexico. And then in Texas, you have the Big Bend sector, Del Rio, Laredo, and Rio Grande Valley. In the western part of the country, most of the border is federal land. This darker green is tribal native land. So here is going to be areas where it's very easy to build. Here, you run into those obstacles. It's also much more rugged terrain through here. Just give you an idea of how the border is broken up. So like I said, our data comes from this article, America's Wall. So you can see here, we have data from 1990 up to 2015, or actually we have up to 2019 currently. But these yellow dots here represent sectors of where fencing was built. This picture here is the entire time period. So this is all where border fencing exists along the southern border. I want to go back a second here to Feigenberg's claim that that is exogenously built. This is based on a comment we got last time I presented this. The Secure Fence Act actually has some language in it that is telling where fencing is built. This is the only part that tells where fencing should be built, and these are all around ports of entry. So it says specifically, you need to build 10 miles east and west of the Tecate port of entry, the Calexico port of entry. This is, if I did my math correct, this accounts for roughly 60 to 70 miles of the border fence. And like I said, about 600 miles was built. So this is the Tecate port of entry. And you can see here, they have border fencing 10 miles to the east, 10 miles to the west, and then a little bit more stretching out further. And you can see here, this is a topographical map. You can see there's gaps where there are mountains, right? So if the grading was too steep, then they didn't build fence there. So that kind of lends to that idea that if it's difficult to build, they're not going to build it. So you could theoretically still cross here, but you have to climb a mountain to get across. In terms of the remainder, you can see, so this is along the Arizona border in the Tucson sector, where there was no mandate of where to build. And so this is where they were building when they had their own choice. In 2006, they built some fencing here, which is flat land on state property. And then flatland here, this green is federal property. They built a little bit over here near the city of Aroca Nogales. In 2007, they added some more. Again, this is flatland on federal property, flatland, close to the road. And then in 2008, they added more, building again around the city, more on the flatland, more on the flatland, more on the flatland. So it kind of lends to the idea that they're building, just where it's easy. Overall, you can see this is again along the Arizona border, the porous areas in the fencing are either very mountainous or very far away from the nearest road. So if you were to cross here, you're going to have to walk 20, 30 miles until you can get to somewhere where you can get transportation into Tucson. All right, so going into the more specifics on the Border Patrol sectors, like I said, there are 9 sectors. They vary in length in terms of the shared border with Mexico. So San Diego is probably the shortest. It has 60 miles of border shared with Mexico. El Centro, just to the east of San Diego, has 70 miles. The longest stretch of border is the Big Bend sector of Texas. It's 510 miles. And then you have a few that are between 200 and 300, and a couple that are between 100 and 200. Prior to the Secure Fence Act, there was some, but very little. So pedestrian fencing was primarily in San Diego. There was about 38 miles of fencing along the San Diego border area, 5 miles in El Centro, Yuma, and Tucson. And these are all going to be around the port of entry. So the areas away from port of entries are going to be largely unfenced. Almost no vehicle barriers, with the exception of 12 miles of vehicle barrier in El Centro and 4.5 miles in El Paso. So you can see in 2005, these 4 areas had no fencing whatsoever in terms of pedestrian fencing, and less than a 1/4 mile of vehicle barrier here. After the Secure Fence Act, a lot more was built, right? So you can see 50, 60, 70 miles in these sectors of pedestrian fencing, 135 miles of vehicle barrier in Tucson. This is largely strewn through the desert. 100 miles of vehicle barrier in El Paso. No vehicle barrier built in these sectors. Some 50 miles of pedestrian barrier built in the Rio Grande Valley. Less than 5 miles built in Big Bend and Del Rio. So in terms of our difference in difference model, these 3, Big Bend, Del Rio, and Laredo, we're going to use as our control group. They did receive a little bit of pedestrian fencing, but it's less than 1% of the total length of the border. So we're counting that as not a really significant amount of barrier being erected. And then the remainders are going to be our treatment group that received fencing. So if you look here, it's a little bit misleading. It's not quite the share of the border that has barrier. It's the length of barrier built relative to border length. So some of the types of barrier can overlap. It's kind of double counting in some areas. But as you can see here, right, San Diego had the equivalent of 50% of its border length worth of fencing prior to the Secure Fence Act, and then it got most of the remaining area fenced off. Areas like Yuma and Tucson had close to nothing, and then the equivalent of 70% of their border length in fencing. Yuma, the equivalent of 90% of their border length worth of fencing. Again, it doesn't mean 90% of the border is fenced off, because again, some of these areas overlap. In terms of what happened with apprehensions following that, so prior to the Secure Fence Act, the largest sector in terms of apprehensions was the Tucson sector. In 2005, they had about 440,000 apprehensions of people crossing the border. San Diego, Yuma, El Paso, and Rio Grande Valley all had between 100 and 150,000 apprehensions. And then the remainders had less than 100,000. Big Bend having the least, only 10,000 apprehensions. What you can see after the Secure Fence Act, in most sectors, there was a drop, quite a substantial drop in Tucson, smaller drops in the other sectors. With the exception of the Rio Grande Valley, there was a slight dip, and then after 2011 or 2010, it started to rise again. In terms of share of crossings in the Border Patrol sector, again, prior to the Secure Fence Act, the most popular place to cross was Tucson. Afterward, it persisted for a couple of years, but then in terms of the share of people crossing in Tucson sector in a given year, fell from about 60% down to about 10%. And then the share of people crossing in the Rio Grande Valley went up to about 30 to 40% of people crossing there. And so this is somewhat significant. Rio Grande Valley, as you can imagine by the name, the Rio Grande runs through there. So people crossing in the Rio Grande Valley are going to be crossing through the river rather than over land, which inherently makes it more dangerous in terms of potentially drowning. Now,
sorry, Mike, can I ask a couple of just clarification questions? I know
sure.
You're not probably going to, I mean, it seems you're doing different, so you're not going to model kind of the decision process of migrants in the sense that, okay, they are going to cross, but not in the sense of, where to cross from and stuff. So I just want to find out if there is any data collected or any sense of kind of migrants' knowledge about these fences being built, or, I know when they get there, they see the wall, but how much are they informed in terms of the wall is being built? What I'm getting to is, if they think the wall is going to get built, they might kind of, bring forward their migrate,
right, try to come through before it was built. Yeah.
So it's just in terms of information, what kind of information they have in terms of kind of decision process that they might, I mean, I know you're not modeling that, but just
right. So there are there's some survey data out there that surveys people on the Mexican side of the border, asking them about their decision to cross and those types of things. We did actually in another paper, I was trying to get some information on like how this changed whether or not you use a smuggler or coyote, they call them on the Mexican border. And the Mexican Migration Project data has information on that at least. But in terms of the time period that we're looking at, the sample size, once you get past like 2006, 2007, becomes prohibitively small to break up on the border sector level. You get some sector years that just have like one observation. And so there's some of that, but in terms of here, we don't have that. I'm gonna get into the kind of the next steps in a few minutes. There are some things that we're trying to model out in terms of where the migrants are coming from, right? There was a large increase around 2013, 14 in the share of migrants who are coming from Central America versus from Mexico. And that's part of it when we think about like who's, as you see, so here there's a huge drop, right, in the number of people crossing. And so one of the questions is like, who's still crossing, right? And it changes the cost benefit analysis, right? So it's going to be, people who would only gain marginally from crossing the border might decide not to. And so it's going to be the ones who have the most to gain in terms of, either if they're coming across, in terms of Central American migrants, but they're coming across for safety. So they might be the most vulnerable. Or they have the largest difference in potential income, right? And so it's going to be primarily probably people from the lower end of the income distribution in their home country who still want to come because the potential gains of getting across the border are higher. And so there's something there in that those people might be more vulnerable in terms of, potentially starving along the way or being taken advantage by coyotes and those types of things, but we don't have that in this data. But it's definitely something that is worth looking at. I know there's a couple of papers that are kind of trying to look at that stuff. But so going back to here, right? So this we've already seen. This is the drop in apprehensions following 2006 Secure Act. The bars here are the total number of migrant deaths counted along the southern border. As you can see, they're relatively flat. There is a small jump after the Secure Fence Act that persists until about 2012, and then it goes back down to pre-2012 levels. But given that the number of deaths is relatively flat, but the number of apprehensions and by proxy crossing attempts is falling, you can see quite, simply that's going to increase the death rate as measured by deaths per 100,000. In prior to 2006, the death rate across all sectors was 34 per 100,000 apprehensions. Pretty close in our treatment and control groups. After the Secure Fence Act, this is after 2008, so after the majority of the fence was built, it more than doubled. In the areas where fencing was built, it almost exactly doubled. And in areas where there was no fence built, it almost tripled. So just kind of put this in perspective for you, like what a death rate of 110 per 100,000 is. The three leading causes of death in the United States are heart disease, cancer, and accidents. So if we were to kind of project that, that would put crossing the border as like the third leading cause of death. And then, the highest murder rate in the United States is in St. Louis. The death rate is almost double that crossing the border. So just kind of give you a sense of how dangerous it is. In terms of then in the Border Patrol sectors and the number of deaths, on the left here, I have just the total number of deaths in each Border Patrol sector. You can see in most of them, it kind of falls a little bit. It remains flat in Tucson until about 2012, and then starts to fall again. But this is going to coincide with the number of crossings in Tucson that falls precipitously at the same time. And then you see here it rises in Laredo and Rio Grande Valley in terms of absolute numbers. In terms of the death rate of deaths per 100,000 apprehensions, relatively flat in San Diego and El Centro, maybe a little bit of a jump in Yuma. You can definitely see the death rate rising in Tucson, Laredo, Del Rio, and Rio Grande Valley. There's, Laredo rises quite substantially, and maybe a little bit here in Big Bend. So in terms of our estimates, like I said, first we run it on the log of total apprehensions. You can see in the fenced areas in our treatment group, it was higher before. So our treatment groups had higher numbers of crossings prior to the Fence Act. After the Fence Act, there was a drop in areas that didn't receive fence. Without any controls, the difference in difference estimator is insignificant. So they dropped somewhat uniformly, you would say. When we add controls to our model, then the difference in difference estimator is negative and significant, indicating that the number of apprehensions fell by a greater share in areas that did receive fence. So to the extent that any decisions on whether or not to cross are due to external factors, right, like income opportunities and those types of things, we would somewhat expect to see kind of this uniform drop across all border sectors. But if we have this significant interaction term, right, then this potentially is indicating that given the decision that they're going to cross in the first place, they might be pushing towards areas where there is no fence rather than crossing where there is fence. In terms of the death rates, we see pretty consistent results both with and without the control variables. Without any controls, there's really no difference in the death rates between the fenced and unfenced areas. After the Secure Fence Act, the death rate in the areas that didn't receive fence rose 82 per 100,000 or 83 per 100,000 apprehensions. The difference in difference estimated coefficient is negative and significant, but it's smaller than the SFA coefficient. So it still rose in areas that got fenced, just not as much. And this relationship holds when we add our control variables. And then in terms of the control variables, hotter days lead to more deaths, and more Border Patrol agents lead to more deaths. So then in terms of, this presentation, right, it suggests that, border fencing is potentially causing people to cross in more dangerous areas, increasing the death rate. It's unclear whether the fence or the death rates have a deterring effect on whether or not to cross. As Matloob brought up, right, it might change the decision of the marginal potential migrant, but there's still plenty out there who are still willing to take that chance. So that's kind of our base preliminary results. So our next steps is getting into a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, we want to look at the difference in country of origins and see how much of a difference that makes. If for migrants from Central America, the Rio Grande Valley turns out to be like the closest place to cross the border. So the increase in people crossing in the Rio Grande Valley might be an artifact of that rather than the fencing in and of itself. We also want to look at the types of fence. So we have some preliminary results, which I didn't put in here, that the vehicle barriers have a larger impact on the number of deaths, which makes a little bit of sense, right? Rather than being able to drive across the border in a van and get taken somewhere safe, you now have to walk. And that means you're out there longer in the heat and potentially running out of food and water. In terms of what we want to build out, so like I said, the data that we have is really granular across space and time. And our difference in difference model does not really take advantage of that. And so, like I said, we're bringing in a GIS expert to help us get more at that data. So what we want to do is look at specific regions of the border and build like a crossability danger index, right? So there's some areas where fence isn't built that has, really steep mountains, which is just going to be uncrossable to begin with. And then there's going to be other areas which is easy to cross, but then it puts you, 50 miles from the nearest town, or you have to cross over the water or something like that. That makes it a little bit more dangerous. We need to look at the difference in the Border Patrol sector's geographic characteristics, right? The San Diego sector is mostly urban. The Tucson sector is mostly desert. The Rio Grande Valley and Del Rio, are mostly rural, but also with the river to cross. And so we're also looking for additional control variables. And then finally, we're trying to, so the number of apprehensions we're using as a proxy, which may not be the best proxy for border crossing attempts. So the Border Patrol publishes information on estimates of the number of migrants that got away in a given year, but they only estimate, or they only report that at the aggregate level, not at the sectoral level, which makes sense. I wouldn't want to publish where most people get away, because then that's where people are going to go cross. But yeah, so that's where we're going from there. I would greatly appreciate any comments, suggestions, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them. See, there's one in the chat, I think.
Yeah, why don't you answer the one in the chat, and then I have a question.
The apprehension data available. Yeah, so it's on the sectoral level. So basically, we have, it'll tell us in like I said, 2005 in the Tucson sector, there were 440,000 apprehensions. As far as I know, we don't have detailed about where the death data is reported on the same level as the apprehension data. There is a data set that we've been looking at. We got some suggestions to try to use that. As I mentioned, the underestimates, there's a data set that actually goes in Arizona. I think it's Humane Borders Project. They actually have the geolocation data on like where bodies were found, personal information about the person, gender, age, cause of death. But it's limited to Arizona, and it's mostly, I believe, Pima County. So we're not able to extrapolate that to the entire border. But that's definitely something that we really want to look at. Yeah, as far as I know, the data on apprehensions at the substation level, I don't think is available publicly.
Okay, Madeline, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, thank you. One of the things over this time period was a shift, that you mentioned, I think, that you're going to look at in the country of origin from Mexico to further south, but also in the composition of the flow in terms of it being more migrants who are going to seek asylum. And so they have an incentive in many ways, if possible, to run into Border Patrol because they want to turn themselves in to start the asylum process. So they may be crossing in less remote areas and therefore at less risk of death. And so that might be one way to motivate that analysis in part, or I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And also another thing during this period was the unaccompanied minors who, those children are certainly deaths that we get a lot of press attention and so on. So I'm curious just if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that we're considering. Yeah, because this like many of the people who are coming now more recently to apply for asylum, are recorded in the data as apprehensions, but in reality they're more surrenders, right? Because they cross the border and they go to the road and they wait for the truck to drive by and they wave down the border patrol agents and they say, all right, let's start the paperwork. And so tangling that because you're going to see, and I think, if we were able to separate those out, right? I mean, that would make the story even more dramatic, right? Because if we were able to isolate just the people who were trying to get into the U.S. undetected and get to some destination and blend in, they're the ones that are going to have to do more traveling to get to a safe place. And so, if we, and given that the number of asylum people applying for like defensive asylum has spiked dramatically over the last decade, I think that would make our coefficients larger, right? I mean, it would make the effect even larger for the subset that are actually trying to get through undetected.
Okay,
yeah,
why don't you take Sarah's question in the chat and then Fani's live?
Yeah, so I just have a very simple question. So where does the vigilantes, all those people who are the landlords or whatever around the border states, where do they fit into the story? Because my understanding is when Trump administration came into the office, I think they gave them a little bit of a freeway, saying that, hey, folks, go do whatever it takes to stop people. So in your analysis, where does that fit in?
To some extent that would also encourage people to cross in even more remote locations, right? Because I think a lot of the Minutemen militia or whatever they were calling themselves, those were primarily, I believe, on like private land, right? So they're protecting their ranch or something like that. And so what you're gonna end up seeing then is that people are going to try to cross more commonly in the national parks and places like that, which are going to, again, be more remote and more dangerous to some extent. That's the issue there, again, is we just have data on the sector right now. And, again, some of these sectors are, the border is 250 miles wide. And so we don't necessarily have where they're, where within the sector they're crossing. Like I said, there is some stuff to be done if as more data becomes available. As I mentioned, the Mexican Migration Project has data, and they ask them where you crossed from. So it gives you like the city in Mexico that was like their last stop before they crossed the border, and that could be used potentially to get a little better understanding of where along the Border Patrol sector they're crossing. But like I said, the amount of data available at the moment, because they only survey a handful of communities in Mexico each year, is not enough to disaggregate in the post-2006 period. But that definitely would be something that would be great if we could get data on it. For Sarah's question, information on location of Border Patrol agents, we have it at the sectoral level. There was, as part of the Secure Fence Act as well, there was in there an increase in the number of agents, I believe, being deployed to the Tucson sector. So in addition to the fencing that they built there, they had another surge of agents there. We looked at earlier, like apprehensions per agent, like if the fencing made any impact on that. And if I remember correctly, like there was essentially no change in apprehensions per agent, which you think the fence should do something like that, because to the extent that you build the fence, then you're funneling people to certain routes, and then you can put your agents there, and you should be able to stop them easier. But if my memory serves correctly, when we looked at that, there was no impact there.
Amos? Oh,
Thank you very much for your presentation, Michael. I have a question, and that is, you mentioned about deterrence, diversion, detour, danger, and death effects of this Secure Fence Act. But I would like to hear a little about the economic effect. Say, would agriculture and service sector survive or get bankrupt without work supply from these migrants and those undocumented immigrants?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, another one of the studies looking at this, the Allen, Dobbins, and Martin paper, they look at the wage effects and find that there's an impact on low-skilled wages and high-skilled wages, which are consistent with much of the literature on immigrant effect on wages, where they're competing with the lower skilled, but complementary to the higher skilled. It definitely would be worth looking at the effect on specific sectors. Madeline has a great paper on that, looking at not the Secure Fence Act, but immigration raids on the meatpacking sector. But yeah, only to the extent that it's actually keeping people out. And like I said, it's hard to disentangle how much of this is because of the fence when it coincided perfectly with the Great Recession, which we saw not only fewer people coming across, but there was a lot of migrants here that went back, right? So people who worked in the construction sector left and went back to Mexico after, and that's partially why you see that dip in those estimates of the undocumented that I had in the second slide. But yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, given that how hard over the last few years they've been cracking down on undocumented immigrants, I know the strawberry farmers here in Central Florida are really struggling in terms of finding workers to pick their strawberries, and investing heavily in automated strawberry picking technology to try to get that up and running to replace the workers. But that's definitely one of the next papers, I guess.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Sergio?
Yes, thank you. Nice paper, first of all. Did you control for, let's say, labor market characteristics at the county level, as in, for example, at the employment level, the unemployment level, or a kind of, let's say, the employment protection legislation, rigidity or flexibility of labor market at the county level?
So that's one of the things that we considered looking at. So one thing that we looked at kind of at the aggregate level to try to see, like, which I didn't include here, to try to see like how much of effect there was on the economy versus the Secure Fence Act, was we created an estimate of the wage gap or the income gap between the U.S. and Mexico at the national level. And that seemed to have the bigger effect on migrant flows rather than the amount of fence being built. We had considered looking at these cross-border income differences, but one of the issues is that a very substantial share of people crossing the border don't stay at the border. They come in, they go to Central and Northern California, Chicago, right? Once they're in the interior of the United States, they don't necessarily stay close to the border, which would make sense, right? Because the Border Patrol has jurisdiction within 100 miles. So I would want to get as far away from the Border Patrol as possible. But that's definitely something that could be worth looking at. And I believe that's what the Allen, Dobbins, and Martin paper did in terms of estimating the income effects. It's potentially possible to do that. There's a paper, I'm forgetting the author's name right now, that looks at location choice, and it turns out that like certain border crossing areas lead to specific interior destinations. Like, so for example, if you're, if you cross in El Paso, which is like kind of in the center of the country, it's much more likely that you settle in like Missouri or Chicago or something like that. And if you cross in San Diego, it's much more likely that you settle in Northern California or Washington State. So it might be a possibility to match kind of those most common corridors, which I know there's some research out there that has already established what those corridors are. But yeah, that's definitely something worth looking into in the going forward in this paper for sure. Yeah, thank you. So let me see. So there's a question here. There's no county border station specific administrative numbers. Not that I've been able to find publicly available. Yeah. Ira, if there's no changes in there's some, again, the Mexican Migration Project is exactly that, right? They survey returned migrants, but again, the period after 2006, there's only a handful of surveys.
Right. Yeah, it's with the numbers are so tenuous. I mean,
yeah, it's well, and that's the problem with immigration research in general. The data is there's a lot that has to be inferred, right? Because undocumented is undocumented, right? So by definition, there's not a lot of good data. It's similar to like trying to have data on crimes that go unsolved, right? Like it's you don't know that, or that go unreported. It's just not there. And even with census data and stuff like that, right? Like we just have, are you foreign born or not, and very little on documentation status. So
yeah, and it's a when you look at how the estimates are actually done, right, for the undocumented stock in the U.S. and its changes, it's a lot of very strong assumptions. A lot, and I would argue that Pew is not any better because they take those assumptions and they make even stronger ones. So it's what we can do, and we understand it. And I give credit because both the census and the Immigration Service and Pew are very open and clear about how they're doing their estimates. So they're not trying to hide the data, but then people take that data and just take it as gospel. 12 million.
Right. Yeah. I just try to use that data for kind of motivation. Like, but yeah, I wouldn't really feel comfortable using that in any kinds of estimates. I think Reinhard has his hand up.
Yeah, a second. Yeah, sorry. I'm the guy with this question with the sector specific information. I know it's a pain to find reliable information. So the reason why I really wonder about this is they must, when they calculate the sector aggregates, they must have several stations. I don't imagine that there is just one border patrol station responsible for a whole 300-mile border. Now, of course, I understand they probably will not release it very frequently or easily, but if there's any way to get your hands on such data, you could basically superimpose a regularized grid like hexagons or stuff like that. And then instead of having this of very strong assumption that as soon as there is 2 kilometers or 2 miles of border fence, the whole 500-mile border is basically classified as being treated, you could then calculate for each actual border hexagon to share. And this gives you quite a lot of power. So you probably gain the possibility to control automatically in your panel for many different local geographic conditions. So automatically you can take care of whether it's a more mountainous area or not. This is basically just automatically solved by that. I think it really opens up a lot of additional powerful analysis also regarding your heterogeneity. So you can then still check whether there are some interactions with time varying factors. But of course, this all would depend on whether there is any way to find leaked or non-leaked data, perhaps via freedom of information request, at least on the substack level, because you can really open up amazing GIS analysis.
Yeah, and that's the hope, is to do a more detailed GIS analysis on it. And I know, I mean, I can definitely get the locations of the substations. I've already seen maps of that. But getting the granular data at the substation level, I'm not aware of anything that's publicly available. And then the issue, a big issue is, you could file a Freedom of Information Act request. DHS is historically bad at, complying with those. Actually, one of my previous articles is actually cited in a lawsuit against DHS, compelling them to with the Freedom of Information Act request. I know was it the Southerns, the paper that Caddy and Jose presented was based on Freedom of Information Act data that they got, that I think they said they waited 3 or 4 years for it. So yeah, I would love to have that data. I'll keep looking, but yeah, that would be very useful for exactly the reasons that you said.
Okay, Michael, Matloob was always very good at stopping things by 9 o'clock. I'm not so good, but we've already lost him. I had already arranged
the observations that have been released. So, sometimes it's really interesting to come up with these strange. Thanks, it's an interesting project, and I'm hoping you can advance it.
So, yeah, we have a tradition of actually stopping at 9 o'clock, and so we violated that a bit, but we will stop. I had arranged for everybody to go and watch Matloob lecture, but I see he shut off his screen. I want to thank you. That was a great paper, leaving to the point and leaving lots of time for discussion. So
yeah, well, again, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It was a great pleasure. I enjoyed being able to talk about this a little bit longer. The last couple of presentations I did were the conference 20-minute presentations where I felt like I was rushing through everything really fast. So it's nice to give the slower version of the presentation. Yeah, all of the comments and questions were fantastic. If anybody wants to talk more, you're welcome to reach out to either myself or Cynthia or Abby, and we can talk one-on-one. If anybody wants to see a copy of the forthcoming AAPNP version of the paper, I'm happy to send it along as well. Just shoot me an email. But yeah, thanks again, and thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.
okay, thank you. Okay, I think Matloob has to shut this down, right?
I think you should be able to do it as the host.
I don't know if he gave me that power. Oh, let's see if I hit end. Okay.
You are the host.
I am. Oh, okay. So I'll hit end.
Just end it. Leave.
Right.
End it.
End meeting for all. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.